For centuries, the scientific method has been our gold standard for finding truth. You know, that rigorous, logical process that's supposed to separate fact from fiction. But what if I told you that this very foundation, the bedrock of our knowledge, is showing some serious cracks? So let's just dive right in with the big question that's being debated in labs and universities all over the world. Is science itself in the middle of a crisis? It's a pretty provocative idea, I know, but it's one that a lot of scientists are taking very, very seriously. To get a real answer, the journal Nature actually surveyed over 1,500 researchers. And the results? Well, they were stunning. A full 90% of scientists believe there is a reproducibility crisis. And look at this breakdown. More than half, 52%, called it a significant crisis. Only a tiny 3% said there was no crisis at all. That's a huge deal. And this number right here, 70%, this is where it gets personal. This isn't some abstract, theoretical problem. We're talking about 70% of researchers who have personally tried to reproduce another scientist's work and failed. It's a widespread, firsthand experience that tells us something is not working the way it's supposed to. So yeah, this is so much more than a statistical problem. It's a crisis of confidence. But to really get why today's scientists are so worried, we first need to understand the powerful ideal the scientific method was built on in the first place. All right, so let's take a quick trip back in time. Where did this whole idea of a formal method for finding truth even come from? It wasn't just invented overnight. No, it was forged over millennia by some of the greatest minds in history. You can trace the roots all the way back to Aristotle, who was the first to really blend observing the world with using logic. Then, the idea of actively testing your theories with experiments got a huge boost from thinkers like Ibn al-Haytham around the year 1021. But it was in the 17th century that things really started to crystallize. You had Francis Bacon championing an evidence-first approach, and then Isaac Newton came along and established the concrete rules of reasoning that became the blueprint for all of modern science. And this quote from Francis Bacon, it just captures that philosophical shift perfectly. The whole game changed. The goal wasn't to start with what you believe is true anymore. The new path to knowledge was to start with doubt, to start with skepticism, and let the evidence and only the evidence lead you to certainty. So that powerful idea, starting with doubt to reach certainty, that led to the ideal version of the scientific method. But as we're seeing, there's a pretty big gap between that ideal and the messy reality of how science is actually practiced today. This is the version most of us learned in school, right? It's so clean, so logical, just a straight line. You see something interesting, you come up with a testable explanation, you run the experiment, you analyze the results, and you report what you found. It seems so simple, elegant, and objective. But what happens when human nature gets involved? Well, that's when things get messy. When Nature asked scientists what actually causes irreproducible research, they didn't blame that neat five-step process. Nope. They pointed to some very human pressures. And what were the top culprits? The relentless pressure to publish, selective reporting of results, and using low statistical power. So let's dig into those factors a little bit. Why exactly are so many experiments failing to replicate? The answers really show this fundamental conflict between the goals of science itself and the pressures of having a scientific career. The ideal, of course, is the objective pursuit of truth, no matter where it leads. The reality, though, is what people call publish or perish. Scientists are basically judged on how many papers they publish when it comes to getting grants and securing jobs. This can create a powerful incentive to get results, any results, out the door as fast as possible, instead of taking the time to do the slow, careful work that's required. And it's a similar story here. The ideal is you report all your findings, whether they prove your hypothesis right or wrong. But in reality, there's this huge temptation to do some selective reporting. You highlight the data that looks great and supports your idea, and you quietly file away the experiments that failed. On top of that, journals are way more likely to publish exciting positive results, which creates a totally skewed record of what's actually true. And this is not just a theoretical problem. This quote from biological psychologist Marcus Munafo shows it's a lived reality. He says when he was a student, he tried to replicate a simple study, failed, and had this total crisis of confidence. And then he learned that his experience was completely normal. It's an accepted part of the culture. Okay, so this might all sound pretty bleak, but here's the paradox. This crisis was identified and is being tackled by scientists themselves. So this isn't really a story about the failure of science. It's actually a powerful example of its greatest strength, its ability to self-correct. So what's the solution? Well, the same scientists who pointed out the problem are also proposing the fixes. And their top rated ideas are all about getting back to the basics: more robust experimental design, better statistical practices, stronger mentorship, and a huge push for transparency through open data sharing. I absolutely love this quote from mathematical biologist Irakli Lolatse. It just reframes the entire issue perfectly. Reproducibility isn't some extra burden or a punishment. It's fundamental hygiene. It takes a little extra time, sure, but it ensures the long-term health of the entire scientific enterprise. It's just part of doing the job right. And this brings us to the final core tension of it all. Science, like Bacon imagined it, is a process built on doubt, on skepticism, and on time. It moves slowly and carefully, but it's operating in a culture that demands speed, productivity, and certainty now. So the ultimate question this crisis forces us to ask is, how do we balance those two opposing forces? And how do we protect the slow, vital work of finding the truth?